So let's dive in. Let's take a really big look at what does the Bible teach us. Let's get a kind of a comprehensive view here. We're going to go through 5 things that the Bible teaches us specifically about financial debt. Number 1, the Bible condemns the misuse of debt. So there's a passage here in Nehemiah. We looked at recently the book of Nehemiah as a church, and if you recall, there's a callback to a previous sermon series that we did, but if you remember, people were making these loans and then they were extracting enormous interest on these loans to people who were already impoverished. That is a misuse of debt. And this is how debt is often used in our society: is rich, wealthy people or banks enslave people into borrowing large sums of money at extraordinarily high interest rates, and it traps people in poverty. The Bible condemns that. It says that is immoral, unethical, and wrong. The second thing that the Bible says is it condemns the failure to repay debt. So if you have debt, if you've borrowed money, and you've agreed to those terms, and you've agreed to the amount and the interest, and you don't repay it, it condemns that. And we just read it here in these verses. It says you gotta pay what you owe, because that's keeping you to your word. Your word, because that's what a debt is, right? You said, I'm gonna borrow this money, and I'm gonna promise to repay it. That's my word. I've committed myself to that. And if I fail to do that, the Bible says we're missing the spirit of the law, which is to love. We're not loving our neighbor. Actually, we're treating people with contempt and even hatred if we do that. The third thing that the Bible teaches about money is it teaches that debt is a form of slavery. So Proverbs 22 verse 7 says, the borrower is the slave of the lender. The borrower is the slave of the lender. Now, what happens if we don't pay our debts? Well, it kind of depends what kind of debt it is, right? It's not the same response, but typically goes to collection, right? And then you start getting lots of phone calls. And if you ignore all those things, eventually someone will show up at your house to repossess items of yours in order to try and get the value of the debt back. And so we might think that our cars belong to us, or our houses belong to us, or the things we've bought, that they're our things. But if we have bought those things with debt, and then we're not paying off that debt, we don't own those things at all. If we just stop paying those debts off at the rate that we said we're going to pay them off, those things will be repossessed from us. We don't own them. And actually, the more we ignore that, the more stress we have in our lives, the more anxiety we have in our lives, the less generous we can be. Because debt, essentially, the reason it's a form of slavery is because what we're saying is when we borrow and we take on more and more debt, whatever kind of debt it may be, the more that we take on, what we're doing is we're mortgaging out our future. We're mortgaging out our future, and we're basically saying that God has to, we're putting ourselves in this position where we're saying that eventually, God's going to have to bail us out at some point, because we've been very presumptuous. We presumed that we will have enough income in the future to pay for the debt that we borrowed right now. And then once we get into a predicament that we're struggling, we're overwhelmed with our debt, we can't keep up with our debt, we're overextending ourselves in all these different ways, then we're kind of putting God in, we're kind of strong-arming God to say, God, you've got to come through, you've got to help bail me out of this situation which I alone have created for myself by borrowing way too much money. The fourth thing the Bible says about debt is it says that lending should be honorable. Lending should be honorable. So Luke 6 verse 35 says, love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Now, this is the Christian idea of lending, is even though the Bible discourages debts and gives us great warnings about debts, there can be times to make a loan or to take on a loan. It's not completely ruled out, but it is strongly discouraged. When it does happen, a Christian who is lending somebody else money, it says, what does it say? It says, lend expecting nothing in return. What that means is, to do it in an honorable way, is to say, I'm going to loan you the money with the expectation that with the agreement that you'll repay it. But if you can't repay it, I'm willing to forgive the loan. Now that would make people really question if they should give loans or not. Because most people give loans because it's a way to make money, because of the interest they can charge. But a Christian idea of loaning is I want to help this person, and if they're able to repay it, then that does help me as well, because I get my money back, maybe with some interest as well, which is a reasonable amount of interest is not necessarily wrong. It depends on the situation, of course. The fifth thing that the Bible teaches us about debt is to be merciful, that we're to be merciful to those who are in debt. So Luke, the very next verse, actually Luke 6 verse 36 says, be merciful even as your Father is merciful. So that's in the context of lending, it says be merciful. So this is expanding the idea of debt forgiveness. But if somebody is suffering from abandonment, or they're in some kind of crisis or some kind of health issue, and people incur debts because of those things, we want to think of ways of how can we help them be forgiven of those debts, or how can we pay those debts for those people because they're in great need. Now, being merciful doesn't necessarily mean debt forgiveness. It doesn't mean that necessarily. It might mean that. There is a time and a place for that. But it doesn't mean that every debt should be paid. It's situational. So it could be that, because some debts are avoidable and some are unavoidable. If a debt is unavoidable, like a health-related debt, for example, obviously that's a great situation to be merciful in and try and help somebody. If, though, somebody's just borrowed and lived this lavish lifestyle, it could be, if they're not in absolute dire circumstances, that they need to bear the burden of that responsibility and learn to pay that off, and that they alone are responsible. That debt should not necessarily be forgiven. It depends on the circumstances and the person's life situation and how desperate their situation exactly is. When you like and subscribe, this video reaches more people.